Hello and welcome back to AP World History. Today we're going to do Unit 7.3, Conducting World War I, and we're looking at how governments used a variety of methods to conduct the war. All right, and and really we're going to be looking at a couple of major things. One is this idea of total war. So the use of political propaganda, what the role of women was, the impact of the colonies, and how they were mobilized, how these populations were mobilized, and of course looking at the kind of increased level of casualties that happen as a result. So part of this is that the effectiveness of conscription and mobilization of colonies. And of course we're talking about increased level of casualties. We're also talking about civilian casualties. So we'll also be looking at the Armenian genocide. Okay. All right. So once again, the Great War, and I generally ask students in class, are you able to identify what this meme is referencing? Part. I've ever had a class not be able to quickly identify Zimmermann telegraph, because you are definitely given that when you're kind of coming up through the system. Okay. All right. So just to basically start off with, when you look at World War I, by the time we get to like 1917, 1918, as the war kind of drags on, you're going to see kind of increased participation in the war beyond simply the main combatants and their colonies. So most countries in the world do actively participate in the war. I generally, just take a moment and ask students, why doesn't Mexico get involved in the war? Obviously, there's a Zimmermann telegraph, right, where Germany is courting them, but why doesn't Mexico actually get involved? And most students are pretty quick to point out, largely because some kids did a project on it, but also it was part of your homework a month or so back. Most students correctly identify that Mexico is in a state of revolution or civil war at this point. So I think Pancho Villa, I think Emiliano Zapata, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So, Mexico is not in a position to be sending troops anywhere for any side, right? They're fighting for their own survival at this point. Right, but it is kind of good to be aware of just how widespread, how many countries were an active part in the war. All right, so one of the very first things we generally talk about is the role of women in the factory, and what are the implications of this? All right, so we generally kind of your homework does take care of this. Strayer does discuss this. And of course, with England specifically, which is what this data is looking at, what is one of the effects of women's active role in World War I? And most students are able to remember when we kind of talk about this in class, that people like Emmeline Pankhurst were very, and other suffragettes used violence as part of their tactics to get suffrage in England, and as a result of that, suffrage was relatively dead on arrival when we start taking at Parliament in 1913 or early 1914. But when the war breaks out in 1914, women generally, support the war effort, and we see an elimination of those kinds of tactics used by the suffragettes. And it's generally connected to as a result of women supporting the country and supporting the war effort, that suffrage is granted. And I'm sure that is a lot to do with it. I'm sure the United States pushing through suffrage immediately after the war as well is also part of the story of why suffrage is passed in England. All right, so when we talk about World War I, I generally, especially in AP World, I generally kind of caution away from having to memorize all the battles. You don't need to know the individual battles and how many died in the individual battles. But I do think it's important to kind of look at these total casualties and keep in mind casualty is a military speak. Casualty refers to death and anyone taken off from any soldier taken off from active service. So someone who dies is a casualty, but also someone who goes blind because of a gas attack is a casualty. Someone who has an arm blown off as a result of an artillery shrapnel, or artillery explosion, that is a casualty. Someone who is shot and may even return to battle in 6 months. That is also a casualty of a battle, right? So it's just kind of understand the verbiage that we're using, right? And but it's important to understand it's important to see these casualty numbers. And of course, understand that this is a consequence of the Industrial Revolution and the industrial era technology. Our capability to kill people was increased, but also because of the Industrial Revolution, our apply to field armies in the millions was also possible because of canned food and factories could produce uniforms and weapons, and so the scale of World War I is simply increased relative to previous conflicts. As far as this kind of basic vocab, most people are familiar with all this kind of stuff. If you do have any questions on this kind of basic vocab associated with the First World War, please feel free to shoot me an email and ask. All right. So largely what we're looking at here, though, is make sure you understand the new military technology. And we'll kind of go through some of this stuff. If you've ever seen the movie War Horse, you see a lot of that technology, and you see the application of a lot of those vocab words. War Horse does talk about no man's land and show you no man's land. It looks at the trench and it deals with gas attacks, and you do see a lot of these issues dealt with in that film. Right, your story homework talks about the Remarque book, All Quiet on the Western Front. If you've never read that book, it is a very simple read, and it is interesting just because it does come from. It does look at World War I and the Western Front from the German perspective, and of course it traces the war through from a group of kids who are recruited together, convinced to join the war by their high school teacher, and then they go through their boot camp together, and then they go and serve in the trenches together. So it's a really good book, and Story talks about it. So, and it is a nice, simple read. When you talk about the Eastern Front, I don't really spend a lot of time on this in World War I. We'll kind of talk more about the Eastern Front in World War II. But in the Eastern Front, it's not known for its trenches. The lines are much more fluid. It's not that unusual to see kind of massive swings of hundreds of miles in the course of a month. With World War I on the Eastern Front. So it's a differently fought type of war there. And also, the losses are gonna result in the revolution. When it comes to naval warfare, obviously naval warfare is another major part of the story, and one of the reasons why World War I is fought all over the world. These navies are large and powerful. So, of course, we're going to be talking about increased military spending on navies during this time, right? So, and the ships are getting bigger and they're getting more and more powerful as we kind of get towards World War I, and then once World War I actually begins, you kind of notice that general tendency to become larger. All right, so. And for all the money put into the dreadnoughts, they only meet in one battle in Jutland, right? Too easily sunk by these cheap U-boats. So the U-boats are, when it comes to naval warfare in World War I, naval warfare, U-boats are the big part of the story. Right, submarines are not invented in World War I. I mean, they're used before the Civil War for the U.S., right? So they're not invented during World War I. However, they are widely used during World War I, and they become kind of the biggest part of the story, of the naval warfare story. And of course, if there's any one thing you need to understand about U-boats is in 1915, right? Kind of this little fact down here. In 1915, the German government changes its policy, its rules of engagement for the U-boats, and they declare that there will be unrestricted submarine warfare, which means any commercial fleets or any boat at all coming into British waters is subject to attack. The idea behind this is, and we've already kind of talked about this yesterday with the causes, England is dependent upon the importation of food in order to feed its population. So if you can sink these merchant fleets coming in, then you will potentially starve the British population, breaking their will to support the war and hopefully forcing an early surrender. That's the idea behind it. And also the British are dependent upon importation from the United States and Canada for its weapons, right, for its armaments. So that's the basic idea behind it. However, most students can name a very famous ship that is sunk as a result of this unrestricted submarine warfare. That, of course, is the Lusitania, right? So the Lusitania sunk here just off the southern coast of Ireland. Okay, and when you talk about the Lusitania, this is it's a passenger ship, and right, why was this passenger ship targeted? The reason why the passenger ship was targeted is the same reason why the sub-commander was surprised that it didn't have a destroyer escort, and that he fired one torpedo and 2 explosions happened as a result. This is a sister ship of the Titanic. If you know anything about the design of the Titanic, you should probably be aware that one torpedo would not have sunk this thing, or should not have sunk this thing. Right, so this is the reason why this thing sunk, and is the same reason why it was targeted by the Germans. It was carrying artillery, right? It was carrying weapons, and this wasn't like some kind of random thing that happened, and it wasn't a mistake. This is an intentional decision that was made by the British Secretary of Navy. You're probably familiar with his name. His name is Winston Churchill. And from Churchill's point of view, and we know this because it's written down. From Churchill's point of view, there's 2 things that can happen if you put armaments on passenger ships. The Germans are going to be either, one, less likely to torpedo it, making it more likely that you're going to be receiving a higher percentage of your armament shipments. Or, what's the worst that's going to happen? The Germans might target it, killing a whole bunch of civilians, and maybe, just maybe, there might be a few Americans involved. And if the Germans kill some Americans, then that might be something that might entice the Americans to join the war effort. So from Churchill's point of view and the British perspective, it's a win-win situation. And Churchill got his way, right? So, it did happen. Americans were killed. And this was used as one of the main justifications for the American involvement in the war, right? Or the Americans joining the war effort. Okay. All right. Just a quick look at some of the different places in which outside of Europe that there's going to be engagements. There's also a lot of East African engagements as well. As far as knowing the individual battles, it's not really important, but it is kind of always good to be aware of some of the bigger ones. Verdun, the second largest battle when it comes to casualties. Just under 1 million casualties at Verdun, and of course the Somme, right? And the Somme is very, very well known for a whole host of reasons. One, of course, is because of the tank, right? This is the first use of the tank, right? And other kind of technological developments, just kind of make sure that you kind of wrap this up, the new military technologies that are going to be used or improved, machine guns. If you're in class, I'll kind of talk about the evolution of the airplane, kind of look at, the French engineers who front mount the machine guns and time the firing of those guns with the propeller so that the bullets fire in between the propeller rotations, and that's of course going to give rise to a much deadlier usage of the airplane. Most kids are familiar with the Red Baron, either through Snoopy or who knows, maybe through the frozen food section of Cheap Pizza. But the Red Baron is easily the most famous of the German pilots during World War I. There was a very famous American who was killed, a very famous American pilot who was killed. The oldest son of Teddy Roosevelt, or President Roosevelt, he was shot down. Over during the war. All right. When we talk about the Somme, we generally in class watch this video. So what this video is, and let me just kind of show you where it is. I did put it kind of just below where this video is going to go, down here. And what this video is this is Joe Sacco, and he's an illustrator, and he's talking about a book that he created on the Somme. In class, I've got a couple of copies of this, and in class we kind of just pass it around and look at it. And what Joe Sacco has done here, I think it's about 24 feet long. He created a panoramic of what the Somme looked like on that first hour, where 10,000 British soldiers are going to be killed in that first hour. And just what it would have looked like there at that moment when soldiers are going up over the top in the no man's land. And you get to see not just the trenches, but also just kind of everything. The artillery staging areas, the medical, where the soldiers were receiving their triage. And he kind of just, and when you look at it, you do get to see the different technology that's present, some of the colonial soldiers that are present there. It's an interesting piece. So there's kind of no way I can digitally show you this. So when you do come back into class, feel free to ask, and I'll pull it out. You're welcome to look at it. Okay, but we watch this in class. It's like 5-6 minutes long. All right. As far as the American entry, I don't spend a lot of time on this. Most students already know this, that the Zimmerman telegraph is kind of part of this reason. I do simply mention with this that there was some debate apparently in England about whether or not to tell the United States about this, because it wasn't the Americans who intercepted this message. It was the British, and the British are the ones who decoded the message. And apparently the debate was, do we tell the Americans about this or not? Because if you tell the Americans about the Zimmerman telegraph, then you're basically telling the Americans that you are reading all the communications coming to the United States from Europe. But the decision was made to tell the United States, and of course, this is also, one of the main reasons given is why the United States joins World War I. So the U.S. will join World War I, and of course, we will deploy. We will use conscription in order to get the numbers. All right. So here's kind of a look at what was promised by in the Zimmerman telegraph. All right. So total war. All right. Feel free to pause and read. I'm gonna move on. All right. So we talk about total war. It's all the countries involved. And you're going to see a lot of, it's not just about conscription and mass mobilization, people. It's not just about turning your factories and directing them towards production of goods. And it's not just talking about women. It's also things that you may not even think about, things like propaganda, propaganda posters and propagandas in the newspapers. So what they will do is they will, they'll use the propaganda to kind of, warn against espionage, but also to rally support for the war. Very famously, the Germans, when they go through Belgium when the war begins, it's a couple of weeks of real bloody street fighting by the Belgians, kind of great resistance by the Belgians, but there's also a lot of atrocities of civilians, and you're seeing being alluded to here, raping of the Belgian women by the German soldiers. Those kinds of stories will be known, and they'll be used in the propaganda posters. You'll also see a lot of reference to Huns in the propaganda pieces, kind of using history and calling upon the memory of Attila the Hun and the sacking of the city of Rome by the Germanic tribes, right? That's so you'll see a lot of those, like that kind of use of propaganda. You also get the modern Uncle Sam and basic recruiting posters, and of course a lot of calling calling towards manhood. Women of Britain say go. You're not a man if you don't go and join the war effort. All right, and of course women were doing their part in the factories, and as spies. Okay, and of course Germans had their own propaganda as well. Right. So, but yeah, so when we talk about total war, it's, women involved in all the aspects of the war as well. And in the case of Russia, they were actually soldiers. Okay. And of course, a lot of these propaganda is going to be used to get people to buy bonds to pay for the war itself. And we kind of talked about this, we always kind of straight talks about this, and we talk about this in class, that because women got, because women got around or got behind the war effort, then this is one of the reasons why we see that we see suffrage being granted. The sins of Emmeline Pankhurst in England are going to be forgiven. Okay. All right. In class, we also, one of the things that we're looking at is why there's such increased levels of wartime casualties and civilian casualties, in addition to things like the Lusitania, or the Paris gun, right? We are, in the targeting of civilian cities, we are also going to see a major example of genocide. And in the case of the Armenian genocide, Armenia, when we used to teach the full world history course before the revision, the first Christian kingdom, the first kingdom to adopt Christianity as its religion is going to be Armenia. So, before the Roman Empire, becomes Christian, Armenia will. So this is a historic Christian population that was without a state by the time we get to World War I. So the Armenian population lived in kind of eastern Turkey, northern Iran, and Russia. Georgia and Russia. And, so when the war breaks out, because their population lives on both sides, the elders and the leadership of the Armenian population decide that they're not going to fight for anyone, so that they're not going to be, pitted against their own people. This will be used as one of the reasons to justify the extermination of the Armenian people. So in class, we watch, I'm just going to show you where it is. If you kind of just look down below what you're watching now, we take a few minutes, and this is another 5 or 6 minute video, from The Century by Peter Jennings, looking at the Armenian genocide. So we watched that in class, where he talks about, the Armenian genocide. There was also a film made about it a few years back called The Promise. And, in class, sometimes we watch, sometimes we'll watch that trailer if we have time. But that was a film starring Christian Bale, if you're familiar with who that is. Right, so this topic has been covered. At the end of the Peter Jennings piece, he mentions that that modern day Turkey has never formally acknowledged that the Armenian genocide took place, and they still haven't to this day. So it is still officially denied by Turkey today. There are some countries that have officially recognized it. For example, Germany has officially recognized the Armenian genocide as having happened. In the United States, it did come up in Congress in 2007, that the U.S. should recognize it as an official event. Sometimes these things happen. You see official recognition by Congress sometimes of these kinds of events. However, it failed, and the Turkish government lobbied Congress and dissuaded them from doing it. If you want a little contextualization of why the U.S. didn't recognize it in 2007, you got to understand that the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq were still very much underway back then, and we were using Turkish airspace to for a whole host of reasons, to go back and forth from Afghanistan and Iran from Germany, for example. So we did not want to upset Turkey and lose access to their airspace from Germany. All right, you can see on this map why. All right. Other things, we usually wrap class up by kind of looking at the different colonial contributions. There is this kind of video that looks at French colonial troops in World War I, and I'll add this to the kind of the collection of videos on my website. So I'll just kind of pause that, and I'll put that on there for you. Yeah, so it is kind of good to look at that, but it's also good to kind of look at these numbers as well, just to kind of give you an idea of just how involved the colonies were, right? If you look at the Anzacs, right, Australia, New Zealand, over 500,000 troops are coming from those two colonies. Canada alone, 600,000 plus. India, right, South Asian troops, just under 1 million troops coming from South Asia. And there's a whole bunch of ways that you can use this data. One of the ways that we often talk about in class, and students generally come up with is the idea that when these troops, especially like take from, I'm kind of just scroll through real quick. I'm going to show you Germany had some as well, right? Germany had colonial soldiers, but, not nearly the kind of numbers. By the way, just look at these numbers. Right, total mobilized, 45 million troops mobilized by the Allies, and in large part due to industrialization, urbanization, and colonization, right, and imperialism. Whereas the Central Powers could only come up with just over 25 million, a massive number advantage because of colonization, right, and industrial and urbanization, right. But when you talk about a million South Asians fighting, you're talking about soldiers who go and fight, and of course, when they go back to South Asia when the war is done, there is a justifiable expectation of equality. They fought side by side with their British brothers, and they're gonna think that that's gonna mean something. And when they do come back to South Asia and they face discrimination by the British, this is going to push a lot of South Asians into the independence movement that is picking up steam in the 1920s. So that's kind of one of the kind of effects that you can kind of look at. When you talk about Gurkhas and Anzacs, you can look at Gallipoli to just kind of see the cost that they bore in the First World War. All right. As far as World War I outside of Europe, of course, was near modern day Namibia, and coming up out of South Africa, and of course a massive amount of naval engagements by the Allies versus the Central Powers. Okay, all right. The armistice, right? Just to kind of wrap things up, and the armistice comes in September through November, right? Is kind of when the war wraps up. In the United States, we generally celebrate this with Veterans Day, right? So to celebrate the armistice that takes place on November 11th. And of course, when the war ends, you are going to see, the death doesn't stop. The famine continues, and of course, nowhere is this more true than in Russia. So the Russian Civil War breaks out, and then most people die because of starvation, right? So, but there's very serious food shortages in Germany at this time, as well as France and Turkey. Okay. So, but one of the other kind of things, and we'll probably talk about this when we get into, the pandemics in, I think it's like topic 9.2 off the top of my head, is the Spanish flu. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we will come back, but this is something that does happen during World War I. So feel free to pause and read through this stuff, but just, when you talk about the Spanish flu, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 million people died. The death rate is really kind of shocking. And you can kind of see when the pandemic hits, this kind of classic W shape. And you can kind of see when it came onto the scene, and then when it peaked. And there's a ton of stuff written about the Spanish flu, Spanish influenza. And I will, on my website, when we get to this topic, I've got a pretty good little article on it as well. And of course, you see the government supporting information, encouraging people to mask. Of course, there was a very real and large anti-mask movement going on, especially as the pandemic reached into the Christmas season. A lot of merchants were very anti-mask because they thought it scared people and it would prevent people from going to shop. So it's kind of an interesting, thing to kind of look back on. But we'll talk about that in more depth when we get into World War. Into pandemics. It's also kind of interesting to kind of look at the different strains. Right, there's going to be mutations of the virus, and of course this mutation that happens around September, is especially virulent and a lot of young people die as a result of this. Something that you hadn't seen in that kind of first wave of the Spanish flu. And then it mutates again and kind of disappears from memory. All right, so but the war ends. It's going to take about 6-8 months. You're eventually going to get the Treaty of Versailles, and we'll reference this, in the next week or so. But part of this whole peace effort is, what do you do, or how do you redraw the map of some of these former empires? And we referenced this the other day, and we talked about Turkey, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and how they chop up the Middle East, and French control, British control, and the creation of kingdoms, like Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Iraq, Syria, where Lebanon comes from, and yeah, these are all come out of these negotiations that started well before Versailles. I mean, these agreements, they start to draw this map as early as 1960. Okay, and then of course, also involved in this is what do you do with the Jewish population? So Zionism had kind of geared up in the late 1800s, and you were starting to see increased migration of Jews out of places like Russia because of the pogroms or persecution in France. So you started to see more and more migration into Palestine, and you're going to see the Balfour Declaration be promised, right? So and here's a copy of it. Okay, so when we start talking about Israel eventually being created, the roots of that kind of go back to this moment, and the establishment of the Palestinian Mandate by the British. Okay, so feel free to pause and read through this. And Stray talks about the mandates and where that all comes from. Right, so yes. So some kind of interesting maps. How things changed from 1914 to by the time we get to 1922, you're starting to see the map of the Middle East looking very similar to how it looks today. All right. So, and this is largely done through the different mandates. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing the former German colonies, the former Ottoman lands, right? They're largely going to be chopped up into these different mandates. I mean, that's what you're seeing there. So, all right. Okay. All right. So other things, wartime GDP. This is kind of always interesting to look at the data. We'll look at this, I guess, more next week as well. When it comes to GDP, who survives or who benefits from the war? Obviously the biggest benefactor is going to be the United States and England. Both England and the United States, when it comes to economic output, fare extremely well. France is decimated by World War One, as is Germany and Austria. All right, and of course unemployment. You're going to see unemployment in Germany versus Great Britain. Great Britain, bounces back really quick after the war, although historically it's pretty low even. But in Germany, you're going to see unemployment, continue. Right, you can also see that unemployment went down pretty much completely during the war because of conscription. Right, you're not unemployed when you're being paid by the military, right? But yeah, Germany's gonna continue to see unemployment after the war. All right, and of course we've talked about this already, right? When the war ends, Russia gets out early, right? So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. All right, so what happens at Versailles? There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens at Versailles. One of the things you need to be aware of is that the map of Europe gets redrawn. So obviously Austria-Hungary no longer exists. The Habsburg Empire is going to get chopped up. And Russia is also going to get chopped up as well. So we do get the creation of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Poland is back on the map as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. We're also going to see the creation of Czechoslovakia. Austria and Hungary are divided into two separate countries, and we get the creation of Romania, although Bulgaria was already in existence from the Ottomans from the 1800s, and then a new state called Yugoslavia gets created. Also, a new state called Armenia gets created as a result of the Armenian genocide. So this will be a Christian country, right, of Armenia that gets created. All right. So just kind of looking at the map, just kind of different. You can see where the change happens. All right, and specifically what happens here in Yugoslavia. Okay. All right. Just a different portrayal of that. Also, one of the effects of the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations, right? So the League of Nations, the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, and is meant to be a collective security agreement by its members, and is designed to negotiate peaceful resolutions, right, to international problems. Of course, one of the issues with the League of Nations is it had no military arm and had no mandate to enforce things militarily. And of course, one of the other issues with the League of Nations is that Woodrow Wilson, in the United States, who come up with this idea, it is never actually ratified by the Senate. So the United States, we don't actually join it. So we would have been the keystone of it. We would have been the thing that maybe would have made it effective. And I say maybe very hesitantly because of the history of the United Nations, the thing that comes after this. But without the United States, the League of Nations is doomed to failure, right? So there's all kinds of great cartoons that portray this. All right, so let's do a quick debrief. World War I resulted in populations on the home front became more involved in the war in unprecedented ways. Use of total war practices in order to garner support, resources. Right? Industrial societies are more capable of developing new technologies that result in increased wartime casualties. Right, so civilian populations are going to get targeted, unrestricted submarine warfare, Armenian genocide, and of course, colonial possessions are going to be a major factor in this war. So additional conflict arenas, access to food and raw materials, and probably most importantly, manpower, like actual soldiers. So that is all for today. Sapriati.